Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You've heard over these past couple of days about a man named Mr. Jackson and how he tirelessly worked to save his company from financial ruin. And he didn't do this by taking the easy way out. He worked hard, had creative solutions, and hired the right people for the job. Mr. Jackson worked to help save the company in an honest and legal way. First, he legitimately hired Ms. Peterson back in July of 2019. As you heard from Ms. Peterson herself and from her resume, she was very experienced in strategic business planning, product line development, and marketing. And Mr. Jackson had this plan to help create a new business. And so Ms. Peterson was a very logical, legitimate hire to help him create this new business plan. And this new business plan was also legitimate. As you heard from Mr. Jackson, the plan was about retooling the company in order to start manufacturing aluminum automobile parts. And you heard from Mr. Jackson that this was legitimate because the auto industry started taking out heavier steel parts in cars and replacing them with more lighter parts made from aluminum, and that they were paying millions of dollars for these parts. So this new business plan made a lot of sense. Additionally, Mr. Jackson had hired a man named Mr. Avery about 2 to 3 months after hiring Ms. Peterson. And as you heard from Mr. Jackson and from Mr. Avery's resume that you saw, he was also a legitimate hire, as Mr. Avery was a tool and die designer, in that he had years of experience doing tool and die design work. And you heard that he had an excellent reputation from Ms. Peterson. And tool and die design work made sense with this business plan because he had to retool the factory. And the defense is trying to argue that, there was a scheme cooked up between Mr. Jackson and Mr. Avery to have this fake plan to save the company, but was really plotting to do an arson and collect some insurance money. But that doesn't add up with the facts. Mr. Jackson already had a plan in place, a business plan, to help save the company 2 to 3 months before he ever hired Mr. Avery. And he didn't seek out Mr. Avery. It was based on a recommendation from Ms. Peterson. So, after the hiring of Mr. Avery, Mr. Jackson worked tirelessly to try to renegotiate this $400,000 loan with the bank. He had multiple meetings with the vice president, Mr. Anderson. And you heard from Mr. Anderson that though the meetings about renegotiating the loan didn't work out, he was actually very interested in this new business plan because he actually thought it was a viable idea. So much so that he actually wrote a memo to the loan review committee at the bank, which I showed you. And it talks about how this new business plan for Flinders was actually a very promising investment, as you saw from his words, his own words in the memo. So overall, Mr. Anderson was impressed with this business plan and wanted to invest. Ms. Peterson was a legitimate hiring. Mr. Avery was a legitimate hiring. This was a very viable business plan that Mr. Jackson had going. You also heard from Ms. Williams throughout the trial and how she suspected that Mr. Jackson came up with this plan to burn down the warehouse for money. And this suspicion is unfounded. She was the ex-lover of Mr. Jackson, She did not see Mr. Avery light the fire, nor did she see or hear of any actual plans to burn down the building. Ultimately, she wanted revenge on Mr. Jackson. She wanted revenge on him because they had dated for 3 years while he was still with his wife. He never left his wife for her after 3 years together. And she said in her own testimony that she was really, really angry when he didn't leave his wife. And then in July, when he hired Miss Peterson, Miss Williams suspected that Miss Peterson and Mr. Jackson were having an affair. And so she was angry about that too. And she never went to Chief Olson with her suspicions of Mr. Jackson until after Mr. Jackson fired her. And so again, ladies and gentlemen, this suspicion that she had was unfounded. And it was all about hurting Mr. Jackson like he had hurt her. And then you also heard from Chief Olson and how he accused Mr. Avery of being an arsonist and accused him of setting the fires at Fass, Yaffink, and Flinders. But Mr. Avery was never arrested for, charged with, or convicted of arson for any of these fires. You even heard from Mr. Korn, who's a supervisor at Yaffink, and you heard how he even threatened to sue Chief Olson because he kept talking about how the Yaffink fire was an arson, and he told him to either bring charges or to stop talking about how it was an arson. And yet still no charges were ever brought. The defense also argued that raising the fire insurance policy in October looked suspicious. But Mr. Jackson said in his testimony that he actually did increase it from time to time in order to account for inflation. And I showed you proof of this on his fire insurance policy. Remember, he took out the policy 10 years ago for $835,000, and then 5 years later, he switched it to $1.1 million. And then this past October, another 5 years later, he switched it to $1.6 million. And so this shows you that he consistently increased the policy every 5 years, and by $500,000 each time. So that just shows you that this suspicion is unfounded, because this behavior of increasing the policy has been consistent throughout the years. You also heard from the expert, Mr. Pincus. Remember, he testified that he had 28 years of fire investigation experience. He taught fire investigation courses. He's even a published author on arson investigations. And remember, his opinion was that this was an accident. And Mr. Pincus is a neutral observer of the facts. But Chief Olson was biased. He performed the investigations of Fass, Yaffink, and Flinders. He wrote reports for Flinders. He interviewed people from the Flinders fire. And so he had a personal bias when he was conducting this investigation. Whereas Mr. Pincus is coming in as a third party just to review the facts and come up with an opinion. And the defense had tried to argue that, no, he is actually biased because he's getting paid. But Mr. Pincus, under oath, said, I normally get paid. This is my standard rate, and it's normal for experts to be paid. And remember that Mr. Pincus's conclusion was that this was an accident. I want to remind you of the evidence that you didn't hear. they weren't able to show you this evidence because it didn't exist. They weren't able to show you a video of Mr. Avery setting the fire. They weren't able to present any witnesses who saw Mr. Avery set the fire. They weren't able to present any witnesses who said that they saw written plans of a plot to set the fire. They weren't able to provide any testimony about any witnesses overhearing plans to set the fire. There was no evidence or testimony of suspicion that an arson was being plotted prior to the fire taking place. So let's do a recap of the main issue of what's going on in this trial. So Flinders Aluminum had a fire insurance policy with Mismo Fire Insurance for $1.6 million. And Flinders Aluminum had a fire at their warehouse that burned it down. And so Flinders Aluminum asked Mismo Fire Insurance to pay out on the policy. But Mismo Fire Insurance refused, saying that there's a provision in the policy that states that if the fire was the result of an arson, they would not pay out the claim. And so Flinders Aluminum then sued Mismo Fire Insurance in order for them to pay out on the claim, because we are arguing today that this was an accident. So ladies and gentlemen, since I represent the plaintiff, Flinders Aluminum, it is the defendant, Mismo Fire Insurance's burden of proof to prove to you by the preponderance of the evidence that this was an arson. And a preponderance of the evidence essentially means more likely than not. So the defense has to prove to you that the fire was more likely than not an arson. So on the jury instruction, when it asks you whether the fire was caused by an act of arson, you will write no, because the defendant was not able to prove that the fire was more likely than not an arson. And then when the next jury instruction asks you whether the plaintiff or its agents acted deliberately to cause the fire, you will write no, because the defendant wasn't able to prove, more likely than not, that the defendant or its agents acted deliberately to cause the fire. And if you write no for either one of these instructions, you must make your verdict for the plaintiff. And so as you heard from Mrs. Jackson, Mr. Jackson's wife, remember that Mr. Jackson would never intentionally burn down a company he loved so much, nor destroy the livelihoods of the 25 to 40 workers he also loved by burning down the entire business to the ground. Thank you.